Today, I will teach you the steps that I took to go from writing mediocre essays the night before they were due to writing quality papers. Hi, I'm Michael, I'm a student at Brown University, and by no means am I a skilled writer. But after reading Cal Newport's book, How to Be a Straight A Student, the writing process became much more efficient and enjoyable. Step 1 is to pick an interesting topic, but more specifically, to pick an interesting topic early. When I read the syllabus for a writing class at the start of every semester, I can see what papers will be assigned, and usually if they're longer papers or essays, I usually see the sort of topic that we'll be dealing with. But if it's a shorter paper, that usually isn't the case. With longer papers, I find it so important to plan out the steps that I'm going to take for writing each portion of the essay, and in a sense following the steps I'm about to teach you. But the first step that I have to follow is to pick a topic that's interesting and that I'll be interested in. Especially if the paper is very long. If I'm going to be spending hours or days researching this sort of topic to write a very long paper on it, I don't want to be researching some boring topic just because I would find it more efficient or easy, especially the few days before the paper is due. So within the week that I know that I'm going to be taking the class, I take a step to put on my calendar a day that I'm going to start looking at topics. And this doesn't necessarily have to be put out on a calendar. A lot of the times just having the idea in the back of your mind makes it so much easier to go back through your memories, especially over the semester, and see what particular topics I could discuss on the paper in the future. So if there was a paper that I had to write about the topic of 20th century Europe, obviously that's a very broad range of ideas to look at, but in general, what I would do is simply go on Google, search up some interesting papers or some interesting articles, and see if I could lead from there. Which leads me into step 2, which is to conduct a thesis hunting expedition. When I find a topic that I find interesting, or a few topics that I find interesting, let's say France in the mid-20th century, then what I do is then I look at scholarly articles or papers on that specific subject. At high schools and universities, there's usually some sort of public access to research articles under different websites. If it's more literary, it's usually something like JSTOR, but if they're more scientific, there are a lot of sources that have those different types of papers. But if I find an article that particularly piques my interest, especially an academic research article, one of the best parts about that is that I simply go down to the reference section, especially if a certain line that is referenced within the citations, and then I see what paper that article is referring to, and then I go into that paper to further research the topic that I'm interested in exploring. Once I have a good idea of the topic I want to discuss and some sort of interesting idea due to the research I found between the links of different articles and their references, the next step is to seek a second opinion. In other words, my thesis is not a thesis until the professor has approved it. In some sort of classes, especially larger writing classes, a lot of the times teaching assistants will be grading the essays. In that case, I find the issue to be a little more complex, but the professor is the authoritative source on the topic you're discussing for that class. So in general, I would email or try to talk to the professor in person, which is even better, about your thesis and see if they can offer any suggestions about the path you can go down. Usually if I do this early enough, the professor is more than willing to discuss the validity of my argument and my thesis, and even provide some potential sources that I could look into to support the paper that I'm looking to write. Because in general, the professor does want to see their students succeed, so getting the approval of the professor for the thesis that I'm writing is a good step to know that I'm heading in the right direction when writing any sort of paper. And even if the teaching assistants are the ones reading the papers, I do believe that if you go through all of these steps, you'll be on a great path to writing a paper that the TAs will approve of as well, especially if the professor approves your thesis. The next step is to research like a machine. For larger papers, this step is so important because I have to accumulate a lot of different knowledge from a lot of different sources. So if I'm writing a very large research paper, then what I would do is I would look at all the sources that I want to look into that are related to the topic and the thesis that I'm exploring, and then I would go and print out personal copies. I stress printing out the personal copies of the papers because there's a difference between even writing on an iPad or annotating on a laptop and annotating in paper and pen. What I'm doing when I'm annotating these sources is mostly skimming them and then reading the intros, conclusions, and the main headings of each paragraph, and I'm looking for any sort of evidence that I could quote in the paper that I plan on writing based on my thesis. Annotating all the material is kind of a tedious process, but once I annotate all of the papers that I have printed out, I simply copy and paste the key quotes that I'm going to write into a Word document. And then what I do is I put all the quotes in the similar category or topic under one labeled category or topic, because this can be some sort of the different stories I tell as I write the paper. related to these different quotes. To decide whether or not I need to annotate more material, what I simply have to do is to look at all the topics that I think are going to support my thesis. Or in other words, look at the topics that I know are going to support my thesis. And then if I can list 2 sources for each of those topics, and I can list at least 1 source for each of the topics that might be able to support my thesis, that is when I know that I have enough sources to continue writing the paper and start drafting it. If it's not the case that I don't have all of the sources necessary, that minimum of 2 for the strong supporters of the thesis and 1 for the possible supporters of the thesis, that's when I know that I have to go back and look for more sources that I can use to write the paper. Once I know that I have enough sources to support my thesis and my argument, I can then go on to step 5, which is to craft a powerful story. Especially with larger papers, the question I'm going to ask is, what am I trying to tell with this paper? And I need to understand where I'm going to go before I start drafting anything, even if I do have the sources. Sometimes it can take me a few days or even a week to try to think of some sort of good outline to the arguments that I'm going to describe with my thesis. And especially with larger papers, the process of thinking out my arguments can take a very long amount of time. What I like to do is to describe my story in a topic level outline. So for example, if I was trying to write about France in the mid-20th century, I could write the first topic or bullet as the context that led up to France in this current state. And then I could write some other topics that I would delve more into based on my thesis, whether it be economics, politics, general history, and stuff along those lines. So writing the different bullets of the topics that I want to discuss in an order that makes sense based on my argument, and then putting quotes under each of those topics, just the bare bones quotes, is one of the best ways I find to make sure that my argument makes sense and will flow clearly when I'm able to write my draft. And this makes the entire process 100 times easier than if I were to try to do everything in one go. However, even after I finish that, I do not start writing yet. Step 6 is to consult your expert panel. In other words, before I even start writing my first draft, I like to go to some friends who are knowledgeable in the topic, or even the professor again, to see if the argument that I'm going to formulate makes sense to them. Again, if the paper is more important, then I'm going to ask more people to look it over. Usually, I don't think it's the best idea to discuss the paper with other people in your class, because then sometimes there can be some sort of accidental plagiarism, but just discussing it with people who aren't in the class or are simply majoring in that sort of topic, or just discussing it with the professor in general, is the key way that I make sure that the argument that I'm about to discuss makes sense and is very clear to understand. So after I've reviewed the argument that I want to discuss with peers or my professor or even teaching assistants, then what I do next is step 7, write without agony. In other words, I can finally write the first draft of the paper. But the best part about this system is that now, writing the first draft is not going to be a tedious process. It's going to flow very smoothly because I understand exactly where my argument is supposed to go for the large part, and I have all the supporting evidence that I need to support my argument without having to go back into the source every time I want to discuss something and trying to figure out what is the best thing to put there. All I do in this step is to follow my outline clearly, or in other words, the topic level outline clearly, and then just write with the supporting evidence that I put under each topic. And these are supposed to be the direct quotes that I highlighted when I was annotating in the previous steps. Besides that, how much I write depends on the length of the paper. In other words, for longer papers, they can go up to 10, even 20 pages depending on the level of the class that I'm taking. But in general, if I'm writing, I tend to set a limit of 3 to 5 pages double-spaced per weekday, and 5 to 8 pages double-spaced per weekend day. Even with the ease of the topic level outline and the argument that I planned out, writing more than 3 to 5 pages is simply going to burn me out, and it's so important to balance out how much I'm writing, especially for longer papers. If the paper is something more of an analysis, then all these steps are very much condensed. In other words, your analysis and your finding of your sources may be limited to just one book that the class is discussing, and then finding those quotes might just be a simpler step, and then developing the thesis and discussing it with the professor again is another part of the process, just much more condensed. In fact, some professors usually expect those sort of papers within a week or 2. I remember in high school when I would used to write papers the night before they were due, they were much shorter, so it did work in a sense, but the procrastination was terrible because I would stay up much later than I had to, and the papers wouldn't be as good as they could have been. So following this method is something that I really advocate for, especially when writing larger papers. Step 8 is fix, don't fixate. In other words, the draft of the paper is done, and now is probably the most important part, which is editing. And when I read this part of the book, I was so surprised because when I would write these shorter papers in high school very much quickly, I didn't really take the time to edit it very consistently or edit it very well. But editing, I find, is one of the most important steps that I can take in terms of making sure that my argument makes sense. So, how many rounds of editing are necessary for a good paper? The answer is 3, and the 3 have separate names. 1, the argument adjustment pass, 2, the out loud pass, and 3, the sanity pass. The argument adjustment pass is done on the laptop that you're typing on. In other words, you simply read through the entire paper and then you simply adjust any inconsistencies in your argument or any major ideas that you want to clarify or change. This should not be a step to focus on spelling or grammatical errors, so those can be fixed at a much later time, but if I do happen to find one, then I'm going to fix that just because I fear that I will forget or miss it in a future pass. The second pass is the out loud pass, and what this entails is printing out the essay onto a physical copy of paper, and then stapling it together and then reading it out loud, slowly as if I was giving a speech. The argument behind this is that when we're simply reading something on a screen, it's much less permanent, and for some reason, we tend to catch grammatical or spelling mistakes much less easily if we're scrolling on a piece of paper versus reading something out loud as if we're giving a speech and if it's on paper. On paper, it's a much more physical, permanent copy, so the words don't easily skip our mind or our brain in a sense. Anytime I'm reading through a essay or paper in the out loud pass, I have a pen with me and I simply circle anything that needs to be fixed back on the computer. And I simply start at the top of the paragraph from when I was reading. Giving the paper in a speech format makes me confident in my argument, but it also makes sure that there's no weird grammatical inconsistencies in the paper as well. After that step is done, the final round of editing is the sanity pass. And the reason it's called that is because it just makes sure that you are confident in the paper and the work that you are handing in. With the sanity pass, what I like to do is after editing all the mistakes I made on the out loud printed set of papers, I print out that edited version onto another set of physical paper. And then I will look at that again, not necessarily out loud, but just simply read through the essay. And in general, I find that this sanity pass simply makes me confident that my argument is strong and clear, and if I ever have the chance of finding some sort of small spelling mistake that didn't get caught in the first 2 passes, then I go back and fix that before turning in the paper. Again, when I'm writing a larger paper, not some sort of shorter analysis paper that can be around 2 to 5 pages, this step can take multiple days. It should take multiple days even. I like to separate the argument adjustment pass from the out loud pass from the sanity pass, so then I have a fresh set of eyes on the paper that I'm looking at. Again, if the paper is much longer, up to 10 or 20 pages or even more, then that step is going to take a much longer amount of time, which is why so many months or weeks are given to writing those longer papers. If you want to know how to ace your exams and quizzes, be sure to click on the video linked here. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell, and I'll see you next time.